Hello there, and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we're turning our attention to a subject that arrives with a little haze around it, not just in the literal sense, but in the way people talk about it. Marijuana tends to be described in extremes. To some, it is almost harmless, a soft-edged way to relax, laugh, snack, and let the evening drift a little. To others, it is treated like a trapdoor in the mind, something that always pulls a person downward. The truth, as usual, is less dramatic and more interesting. What marijuana really does to your brain is not best understood through slogans, panic, or wishful thinking. It is best understood by slowing down and looking carefully at what changes, what gets louder, what gets quieter, what gets delayed, and what the brain has to do afterward to find its balance again. So before we get into any of that, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your little corner of the world. There is something fitting about that, because marijuana has a curious way of changing time as it feels from the inside. Minutes can stretch, thoughts can wander, and the ordinary rhythm of an hour can suddenly feel less reliable than it did a moment before. And if you find this soothing, helpful, or simply a gentle way to wind down, I'd be grateful if you liked the video and subscribed. It helps this quiet corner reach other people who might want a slower, calmer way to think about science at the end of the day. Now settle in, let your shoulders drop a little, and let's take this apart carefully, because what marijuana does to the brain is not magic, not mystery, and not quite the simple story people often tell. A good place to begin is with the word itself, because even that can blur things. People say marijuana, cannabis, weed, THC, CBD, edibles, vapes, flour, oil, gummies, as though all of these are interchangeable, but they are not. Cannabis is the plant. Marijuana is the common term many people still use for cannabis products, especially those used for their mind-altering effects. THC, short for tetrahydrocannabinol, is the main psychoactive compound, the one most responsible for the feeling of being high. CBD is another major compound, but it does not produce that same intoxication, and right away, that tells us something important. When people say marijuana affects the brain, they are often talking about a wide range of products that can differ in strength, in how quickly they act, in how long they last, and in what combination of chemicals they bring along. That is one reason experiences vary so much from person to person. Another reason is that your brain is not meeting cannabis as a total stranger. It already has its own signaling network, often called the endocannabinoid system, which helps regulate balance across functions like mood, memory, appetite, pain, and stress response. In very broad terms, your brain already uses its own cannabinoid-like messengers as part of normal communication. THC does not politely knock and ask whether it may enter the room. It imitates part of that language, then says too much, in the wrong places, for too long, and in ways the system was not designed to hear. That is when perception shifts, attention changes, and the brain begins responding to a signal that resembles one of its own, but arrives with different timing, different strength, and very different consequences. That is why the early effects of marijuana can feel so oddly specific. A person may not simply feel different in some vague, cloudy sense. They may feel that sound has more texture, that music has moved closer to them, that their own thoughts are somehow louder and farther away at the same time. A simple idea may suddenly seem enormous. A pause in conversation may feel much longer than it really is. A sentence begun with confidence may drift off midway because the next thought never quite arrives on schedule. These effects are not random. Health agencies describe recent cannabis use as having immediate effects on thinking, attention, memory, movement, coordination, judgment, and time perception. That list is less glamorous than the language people often use about the experience, but it is more useful. If time seems slower, it is because the systems involved in perception and attention are being altered. If thoughts seem profound, part of that may be genuine curiosity, but part of it may also be loosened filtering and changed judgment. If a person keeps forgetting what they were saying, it is because short-term memory, especially the ability to hold and work with a thought for a few seconds, is one of the functions THC can interfere with. The brain normally does a great deal of quiet housekeeping. It decides what matters, what should be ignored, what should be held in mind, and what should be moved along. Marijuana can disrupt that housekeeping, not always in a dramatic way, and not always unpleasantly, but enough that the flow of thought, sensation, and self-awareness can become noticeably less stable. That is one reason some people describe the experience as relaxing and amusing, while others describe it as mentally cluttered. The same shift that feels interesting in one context can feel frustrating in another. A stroll, a sofa, and a silly conversation are one thing. A difficult task, a fast road, or a room full of strangers is quite another. This is where the cultural story often gets too simple. People sometimes imagine marijuana as a calm-only substance, a plant that merely softens the edges of a hard day. And yes, some people do experience reduced tension, laughter, lowered inhibition, or a temporary feeling of ease. But the same shift in brain signaling can also produce anxiety, confusion, suspicious thinking, or outright paranoia. Especially when the product is strong, the setting is uncomfortable, the person is inexperienced, or the mind was already uneasy to begin with. It is not hard to see why. If attention becomes distorted, if time changes shape, if ordinary sensations become unusually vivid, and if short-term memory is less dependable, then the brain can begin misreading its own experience. A passing sound may seem more significant than it is. A harmless social moment may feel loaded. A simple thought may loop because it is no longer being sorted and released efficiently. This is one reason the same drug can be described by one person as peaceful and by another as unpleasant. The brain is not a blank wall on which THC paints the same picture every time. It is an active system bringing its own expectations, fears, temperament, and current state into the encounter. Potency matters too. Frequency matters. Age matters. Whether alcohol or another substance is also involved matters. Even the difference between inhaled and edible products matters, because the timing changes the whole experience, and the brain tends to dislike surprises when the surprise is happening from the inside. All of this also explains why cannabis can impair driving. Safe driving depends on timing, attention, coordination, decision-making, and the ability to judge what is happening around you with reasonable accuracy. Those are exactly the kinds of functions cannabis can affect. So while people sometimes talk as though marijuana simply makes a person mellow, the more precise description is that it changes the brain systems you rely on to stay oriented, measured, and quick when the world asks something of you. There is another layer to this, and it matters enough that it should not be brushed aside with a casual shrug. The developing brain appears to be more vulnerable. Public health guidance now states this quite clearly. The brain continues developing into the mid-20s, and cannabis exposure during adolescence and young adulthood may affect how the brain builds and strengthens the connections involved in attention, learning, memory, and problem-solving. That does not mean every teenager who uses marijuana will be permanently damaged. Science is almost never that tidy or absolute. But it does mean that early use is not best understood as a smaller version of adult use. It is a different situation, because the brain itself is in a different condition. Construction is still underway, and changing the signalling environment during that time may have longer-lasting consequences. That is also where questions of frequency start to matter more. Occasional and heavy use are not the same thing. Early and later first use are not the same thing. Agencies like the CDC and NIDA also note that frequent use is linked in some users with a greater risk of cannabis use disorder, and with higher risk of psychosis or schizophrenia-related outcomes in vulnerable people, especially when use begins earlier and occurs more often. That does not mean marijuana causes the same outcome in everyone. It means the brain is not responding in a vacuum. Genetics matter. History matters. Mental health matters. The individual brain matters. And once again, the simplest story is not the most accurate one. marijuana is neither a harmless cloud nor a guaranteed catastrophe. It is a psychoactive substance interacting with a living organ that is still changing, still adapting, and in some people more fragile than it appears from the outside. It is also worth being honest about something else, because once this topic enters public conversation, people often feel pushed to choose a team. Either cannabis is spoken of as though it belongs in the medicine cabinet beside every human trouble, or it is spoken of as though any discussion of possible medical value must be reckless. Neither approach is very helpful. The evidence does support some medical use of cannabinoid-based drugs in certain limited situations. Official sources note approved uses for specific cannabinoid medicines, such as some rare forms of epilepsy, chemotherapy-related nausea and vomiting, and appetite loss associated with HIV/AIDS. There is also some evidence of modest benefit in certain pain and multiple sclerosis settings. But that is not the same as saying that recreational marijuana is harmless for the brain, or that every form of cannabis does the same thing, or that a person's pleasant personal experience cancels out the known risks. A prescription product with a defined dose in a medical context is not the same thing as a high THC, edible taken casually, a vape used repeatedly throughout the day, or a strong strain used by someone whose brain reacts badly to uncertainty and altered perception. The modern conversation often gets confused because the same plant family contains compounds with different effects, and because the same word gets used for medical preparations, casual use, heavy use, occasional use, and every possible opinion about all of them. But your brain does not care very much about cultural arguments. It cares about chemistry, timing, dose, expectation, context, repetition, and recovery. That is part of what makes the subject so interesting. We are not talking about a simple switch called relaxed or not relaxed. We are talking about a system that influences memory, mood, motivation, attention, perception, and bodily rhythm all at once, which is why marijuana can feel so personal, even while the underlying biology follows patterns researchers can describe. And perhaps that is the calmest, clearest way to begin this whole conversation. What marijuana really does to your brain is not one single thing. It changes signaling in a system that normally helps keep internal balance. It can distort attention, alter the sense of time, interfere with short-term memory, change mood, reduce coordination, and affect judgment. In some people it feels soothing, in others it feels unsettling. In some brains, especially younger ones or more vulnerable ones, the long-term stakes may be higher. In some medical settings, certain cannabinoids may offer real benefits, and in ordinary life, the same substance that makes one person sink peacefully into a sofa can leave another person standing in the kitchen holding a spoon, wondering what they came in for and why the refrigerator suddenly seems unusually important. That is the human part of the story, and it is also the scientific part. The brain is always trying to keep itself in order, and marijuana changes the terms of that work. So before we get into memory, mood, sleep, adaptation, and the longer pattern that repeated use can create, we need to start with the first moment of contact, the instant THC begins moving through the body and toward the brain. Because that is where the quiet rearrangement begins, and once you understand that first step, the rest of the story starts making a great deal more sense. The first contact happens faster than most people imagine, not the first laugh, or the first dry mouth, or the first moment when the room seems a little softer around the edges, but the chemical beginning, the point where THC starts its trip toward the brain. If cannabis is inhaled, whether by smoking or vaping, THC is absorbed quickly and moves through the bloodstream with remarkable speed. If it is eaten instead, the process is slower, less predictable, and much easier to underestimate. That difference matters, because people often speak about marijuana as though it produces one neat standard experience, when in reality the route into the body changes the timing of everything that follows. An inhaled product can begin shifting experience quickly enough that a person notices the change before they have even fully settled into the chair. An edible may wait, linger, and then arrive late with more force than expected, which is one reason people sometimes take more before the first dose has fully declared itself. THC is not just entering the body in some general way, it is beginning a timed encounter with the brain, and timing is one of the main reasons the experience can feel smooth, surprising, awkward, or overwhelming. CDC notes that edibles can take from 30 minutes to 2 hours to produce intoxicating effects, and that those effects may last longer than expected, while NIDA materials note that THC rapidly reaches the body, including the brain, and attaches to receptors on nerve cells. What makes THC so effective at changing experience is that it does not arrive as a completely foreign intruder. The brain already uses a signaling system that works with cannabinoid-like chemicals made inside the body. In ordinary life, brain cells communicate through chemical messages that cross tiny gaps and fit into receptors a bit like keys fitting into locks. NIDA describes neurotransmitters that way for a reason, because it helps explain why certain drugs can affect the brain so powerfully. Some drugs can mimic the shape of natural signaling chemicals closely enough to activate receptors and alter normal communication. Marijuana is one of the examples NIDA gives. THC does not recreate the brain's own message perfectly, but it resembles it enough to get into the conversation. That is why the change can feel less like a switch being flipped, and more like a familiar system being nudged off its normal rhythm. The message is not pure nonsense. It is a borrowed accent spoken too loudly at the wrong moments, in places where the brain expects something more subtle and much shorter-lived. Once that happens, cells that usually send tidy, well-timed signals begin operating under altered instructions. Some messages are amplified, some are delayed, some are made fuzzier than they should be, and that is really the beginning of the high, not a mystical cloud drifting over consciousness, but a change in signaling, in timing, and in the brain's quiet ability to keep itself organized. That early disruption is not evenly spread across the brain. THC attaches to receptors in many regions, and those regions happen to be involved in exactly the functions people most often notice changing: memory, attention, sensory perception, coordination, judgment, emotion, and reaction time. NIDA says THC interferes with normal functioning within brain regions, and CDC says cannabis directly affects the parts of the brain responsible for memory, learning, attention, decision-making, coordination, emotions, and reaction time. Older NIDA educational material explains the same idea more anatomically, pointing to areas such as the cerebral cortex, limbic system, and cerebellum, which helps make sense of why thoughts may become scattered, why emotion can become unusually immediate, and why movement can turn slightly less precise. This is where a person may start to feel that music sounds richer, that a passing comment seems more important than it probably is, that memory has become a little slippery, or that pouring a glass of water now requires the sort of concentration once reserved for performing surgery, not because THC creates entirely new abilities or entirely new forms of thought, but because it changes how the brain filters, prioritizes, and coordinates the information already flowing through it. The ordinary traffic of the mind begins meeting altered signals at several intersections at once. One of the first things many people notice is that perception no longer feels properly edited. Under normal conditions, the brain is constantly deciding what deserves attention and what can be ignored. That soft hum in the background, the texture of the fabric on your sleeve, the distance between one thought and the next, the tiny shifts in a person's facial expression across the room, all of that is being filtered so experience remains manageable. THC can loosen that filtering. NIDA materials describe marijuana as changing brain messages in ways that alter sensory perception and coordination, and CDC notes immediate effects on thinking, attention, memory, movement, and time perception. That is why time may begin to stretch, why sound may feel layered, why the mind can become fascinated with something small and stay there much longer than intended. It is not necessarily that the outside world has become richer. It is often that the brain has become less selective. Signals that would normally be sorted, quieted, or moved along are allowed to linger. A person may feel as though they are noticing more, but what they are often experiencing is a change in the system that ranks what matters. The brain is still receiving information. It is just becoming less efficient at deciding how much weight each piece deserves. That can feel pleasant, funny, and strangely interesting in a quiet setting. In another setting, it can feel distracting, confusing, or exhausting. The mechanism does not change simply because the mood changes. The same altered filtering is there either way. Memory is often one of the earliest casualties of this rearrangement, and it usually goes in a very specific way. People do not typically forget their own name or suddenly lose every fact they know. The trouble is more immediate than that. It affects the ability to hold a thought in place long enough to work with it. A sentence begins, takes a turn, and then dissolves halfway through because the brain has lost its grip on the middle. A person opens the fridge and then has to stand there like a polite visitor, waiting for the purpose of the trip to reintroduce itself. This is one reason cannabis is so often associated with scattered speech, repeated questions, and the quiet comedy of people forgetting what they were just talking about while still being very interested in continuing the conversation. CDC describes immediate effects on memory and attention, and NIDA notes impaired thinking and memory as short-term effects of THC-containing cannabis products. That pattern makes sense when signaling in memory-related regions is being disrupted. The brain is still producing thoughts, but the handoff from one moment to the next becomes less reliable. Working memory, that temporary mental holding area that lets you keep the last few seconds of your mind in order, becomes easier to interrupt. And because attention is also affected at the same time, the brain is less able to repair the interruption gracefully. It does not simply lose the thread, it sometimes forgets there was a thread at all. Coordination and reaction time are changed by the same general principle. People often separate the mental and physical effects of marijuana as though one is in the head and the other is in the body, but the body is being guided by the same altered signaling. If the brain areas involved in movement, balance, timing, and judgment are working under disrupted conditions, then actions that normally feel automatic become less sharp. CDC warns that cannabis can slow reaction time, impair coordination, distort perception, and affect judgment in ways that matter for driving. That warning is not just a legal formality. Driving is one of those activities that exposes whether your brain is still ranking incoming information quickly and accurately. A lane change, a brake light, a pedestrian near the curb, a delayed response to a bad decision made by somebody else on the road, all of these depend on timing and attention staying clean. Cannabis does not need to make a person feel wildly intoxicated to interfere with those abilities. It is enough that perception is distorted a little, decisions are slower, coordination is dulled, and confidence is not quite tracking competence. The brain under THC can feel calm without being clear, and that distinction is more important than people like to admit. A person may feel unbothered and still be impaired. In fact, feeling pleasantly unbothered can be one of the reasons they fail to notice how much precision has already gone missing. The difference between inhaled THC and edible THC becomes especially important here, because timing changes the story the brain tells itself. With inhalation, the shift often arrives quickly. The person experiences a closer link between the act and the effect, which at least gives the brain some warning about what is happening. With edibles, there can be a delayed calm before the change, and that delay creates its own trap. CDC says intoxicating effects from edibles may take 30 minutes to 2 hours to appear, and may last longer than expected. That gap can fool people into thinking nothing is happening, which leads them to take more. Then the brain is not meeting one signal but a larger one later, after the expectation of control has already settled in. This is one reason edibles can catch people off guard. The person feels fine, decides the dose was weak, and then finds that the experience has quietly been building behind the curtain the whole time. By the time the first strong effects arrive, the second decision has already been made. That delayed timing also changes the emotional side of the experience. A quick onset can feel easier to interpret. A delayed onset can feel uncertain, and uncertainty itself is not especially soothing to the human brain. When sensations begin changing and the person did not expect them to change quite yet, the mind may begin monitoring itself too closely. That is often where the experience shifts from relaxed curiosity into self-consciousness, unease, or the sense that something is somehow not right, even if what is happening is simply the dose finally arriving. This is also why setting matters so much during the first phase. The same early brain changes can be read as pleasant or threatening depending on context. If a person is in a safe place, with little demand on attention, the loosening of ordinary filtering may feel interesting. If the room is noisy, the social pressure is high, or the person already tends toward anxiety, the very same changes can feel uncomfortable. A sound that might otherwise be ignored now lingers. A glance from another person now seems worth analysing. A passing thought now gets promoted to a major event. Neda notes that THC-containing cannabis products can change mood, thoughts, and perceptions of reality, while CDC emphasises effects on attention, memory, emotion, and time perception. Put those together, and the result is easy to picture. The brain is taking in altered signals, struggling to prioritise them cleanly, and then trying to interpret what those altered signals mean. That is fertile ground for laughter in one person and worry in another. The chemical entry point may be the same, but the mind meeting that signal is never identical from one person to the next. Experience, expectation, dose, age, and emotional state all matter. THC begins the signal change. The person's brain then does the rest of the storytelling. Potency adds another layer to that first contact. CDC notes that the impact of cannabis on the brain depends on factors including how much THC is in the product, how often it is used, age of first use, and whether other substances are used at the same time. This is important because modern cannabis products are not all working at the same strength. When people talk casually about weed as though it were a single stable thing, they flatten a very important reality. The brain's first contact depends on concentration. A stronger product gives the receptors more to respond to, and that can intensify the disruption of attention, perception, memory, and coordination. Using alcohol or another drug at the same time can increase impairment further. That means the opening minutes of the experience are not just about the brain meeting THC, but about how much THC, how quickly, in what form, and under what other chemical conditions. One person taking a low dose in a quiet evening is not having the same first contact as another person using a strong concentrate at the end of a stressful night while also drinking. The brain does not reduce those experiences to the same category simply because both involve cannabis. It responds to dose, context, and combination. And from the brain's point of view, those differences are not decorative details. They are the whole event. There is also a quiet irony in how normal this all can feel from the inside. THC is not usually announced with trumpets. More often it enters experience in a series of small alterations. A person grows slightly more inward. The conversation becomes oddly textured. The body feels a little heavier or a little lighter. Time becomes less trustworthy. Memory loses some grip. A task that was simple 5 minutes ago now seems faintly inconvenient, as though the instructions have been misplaced by someone in the management department. This gradualness is part of why people sometimes underestimate what is happening. The brain is changing its signal processing, but because consciousness remains continuous, the person often feels like the same self all the way through. They do not feel like a different person. They feel like themselves, just softer, slower, funnier, hungrier, more thoughtful, more distracted, or more uneasy. That subjective continuity can hide the extent of the underlying change. From the outside, it may be obvious that attention has narrowed or reaction time has slowed. From the inside, it can feel like nothing dramatic has happened at all, and yet the science is fairly clear that recent cannabis use has immediate effects on thinking, time perception, memory, movement, and attention. The fact that those changes can feel ordinary while they are unfolding is one of the reasons the first contact is so easy to misread. The mind is being altered by a signal change, but the narrator inside the mind is still speaking in the first person, so the first contact is not really a single moment, even though we talk about it as one. It is a sequence. THC enters, it travels, it reaches the brain, it attaches to receptors that are part of a signaling language the body already uses. It interferes with ordinary neurotransmission. The brain begins to rank sensation differently, hold memory less securely, judge time less accurately, and coordinate action less cleanly. The person begins noticing changes in perception, attention, mood, and self-awareness. From there, the rest of the experience unfolds. That is the true beginning, and it is much more interesting than the cartoon version people usually carry around. Marijuana does not simply make a person relaxed, silly, or spaced out by some vague magic. THC steps into an existing biological system and starts changing the way messages are sent, received, and prioritized. And to understand why that borrowed message has so much influence, why the brain responds to it at all, and why the effects reach into memory, appetite, stress, pain, and mood. With such strange efficiency, we have to move one level deeper and look at the system it is stepping into, the one that was already there long before the smoke, the vape, or the edible ever arrived. What THC meets when it reaches your brain is not an empty room. It is a system that was already there, already working, and already busy helping your brain stay stable from one moment to the next. Scientists call it the endocannabinoid system, and despite how often cannabis is discussed as though it introduces something entirely new, this network is made of the body's own cannabinoid-like messengers, their receptors, and the enzymes that build and break them down. In broad terms, it is part of how the brain adjusts itself. It helps shape neuronal activity in the mature nervous system, supports brain development earlier in life, and contributes to maintaining homeostasis, which is the body's constant effort to keep things from swinging too far in any direction. Official NIH and related sources describe the system as influencing processes such as brain development, appetite, pain, mood, and memory, which is one reason marijuana affects such a wide range of experiences rather than just producing one simple feeling called high. At the center of this network are two major endocannabinoids, anandamide and 2-arachidonylglycerol, usually shortened to 2AG. They are not exactly little packets of stored pleasure waiting on a shelf. They are lipid-based signaling molecules the body makes and uses as needed. Search summaries from NIH and NIDA sources describe anandamide and 2AG as the main endogenous cannabinoids, and one NIDA research summit summary goes so far as to describe 2AG as the workhorse endocannabinoid involved in a wide variety of physiological functions, while anandamide is described there as more closely tied to stress-related signaling. That is a useful distinction, not because the two have perfectly separate jobs, but because it reminds us that this system is not one button. The brain presses for one effect. It is more like a control panel with overlapping jobs, different timescales, and different areas of influence. Appetite, motivation, mood, pain modulation, learning, and memory are all touched by it in some way, which means that when THC enters the picture, it is stepping into a system that already has a broad reach. The receptors matter just as much as the messengers. Two main receptor subtypes are usually discussed, CB1 and CB2. CB1 receptors are the ones most relevant to the psychoactive experience of marijuana. NIDA's summit summary says CB1 receptors mediate most of THC's psychoactivity, and NIMH materials describe CB1 receptors as abundant in the brain, and located at presynaptic nerve terminals. That location is a very important detail because presynaptic terminals are where neurons release chemical signals onward to other cells. CB2 receptors are also part of the endocannabinoid system, but reviews summarized by NIH sources describe them as having a more defined pattern in the brain and being found predominantly in cells and tissues of the immune system. So when people talk about marijuana changing thought, memory, time perception, attention and coordination, they're mostly talking about THC acting at CB1-rich brain circuits. That helps explain why the mental effects are so immediate and so noticeable. THC is not floating around the brain looking for random trouble. It is interacting with a receptor system that is already positioned at key points in neural communication. The way this system works is one of the most interesting parts because it does not always send signals in the usual direction. In many synapses, endocannabinoids act as retrograde messengers. That means the receiving side of the synapse can send a message backward across the gap to the sending side. NIH review summaries describe retrograde signaling as the principal mode by which endocannabinoids mediate both short and long-term forms of synaptic plasticity, and several search results note that endocannabinoids released from postsynaptic neurons travel backward to activate CB1 receptors on presynaptic terminals. The practical meaning of that is wonderfully ordinary. If one neuron is getting too much input, the system has a way to say, in effect, "That is enough for a moment, calm down." It is a feedback signal. It can reduce the likelihood of further neurotransmitter release and help adjust the tone of the conversation between neurons. That is a large part of why researchers describe the system as helping maintain balance. It is involved in fine-tuning, not in shouting. It is about modulation, not constant domination. That is also why an outside chemical like THC can be so disruptive. It is stepping into a network built for brief, targeted, feedback-style control. This feedback style also helps explain why the endocannabinoid system is tied so closely to plasticity, which is the brain's ability to adjust the strength of its own connections over time. NIDA's Neuroscience Summit summary notes that endocannabinoids play a role in synaptic plasticity, and that CB1 receptors are found on neurons involved in that plasticity. NIH review summaries say the system plays a key role in short and long-term synaptic plasticity in brain regions involved in many neural functions. That can sound technical, but the idea itself is simple enough. Your brain is not a fixed machine. It is constantly tuning itself based on experience, demand, stress, reward, learning, and repetition. The endocannabinoid system is one of the tools it uses in that tuning process. It helps regulate how much signal is passed along, how long a response lasts, and how circuits adapt to repeated patterns. So when THC activates the same receptor family from the outside, it is not just adding a sensation. It is leaning on one of the systems the brain uses for adjusting itself. That is why the effects can spill into memory, focus, mood, appetite, and movement all at once. The system it meets is woven into the brain's housekeeping. Another important feature is that the brain's own endocannabinoid signals are not meant to hang around for very long. They are produced on demand and then rapidly cleared. Search results from NIH and NIDA materials point to the main degradative enzymes, FAA and MAGL, which break down anandamide and 2-AG respectively. FSH inhibition raises anandamide, MXGL inhibition raises 2-AG, and those enzymes are repeatedly described in NIH and NIDA sources as the primary hydrolytic or catabolic enzymes for those messengers. That tells you something useful about the design of the system. Its natural signals are brief enough that the brain has dedicated machinery for shutting them off. It is built for moment-to-moment regulation, not for a long chemical monologue. So when THC arrives, it is not participating in the same rhythm the way a natural endocannabinoid would. It is acting on the same receptors, yes, but as an outside compound rather than as a tightly timed internal feedback signal. The brain can still respond to it, because the receptors recognize the message well enough, but the fit is functional, not elegant, A system made for precise local adjustment is suddenly dealing with a broader external signal, and that is where the tidy balance begins to wobble. There is a reason this network exists beyond simply making life more chemically interesting. It appears to help the nervous system remain adaptable without becoming chaotic. Review snippets from NIH sources describe it as a central regulatory system, important for homeostasis, neurophysiology, neuronal activity and brain plasticity. NIAAA materials also describe it as affecting appetite, pain, mood, memory and brain development. Put all of that together and the pattern becomes clear. The endocannabinoid system is one of the brain's balancing systems. It helps shape how strongly certain signals are felt, how stress is handled, how reward circuits respond, how pain is modulated, and how learning-related circuits adapt. That does not mean it is a little internal peacekeeper that always makes you calm. Real brain biology is rarely so charmingly simple, but it does mean the system is involved wherever the brain needs flexibility without losing control. Too much excitation is a problem. Too little responsiveness is also a problem. Circuits need room to adapt, but not so much room that everything turns noisy and unreliable. The endocannabinoid system seems to help with that ongoing negotiation. It keeps the volume from becoming only one thing all the time. This becomes especially important when talking about the developing brain. NIH-related sources say the endocannabinoid system plays a central role in the developing nervous system, and NIAAA explicitly notes that the molecules and receptors of this system affect brain development. That matters because development is not just growth in size, it is a long process of connection building, pruning, timing and calibration. A system involved in synaptic plasticity and developmental signaling is not a casual extra. It is part of the machinery by which the brain learns how much of a signal is enough, which connections should be strengthened, and which should be quieted. That is why concerns about cannabis use in adolescence and early adulthood are not based only on moral panic or old stereotypes. They are rooted in the fact that THC is acting on a signaling system that contributes to development itself. If you interfere with a mature balancing system, you may temporarily impair memory, attention, and coordination. If you interfere with a system still helping organize a developing brain, the concern becomes deeper. The point is not to become dramatic. It is simply to see the system in the right scale. This is not a decorative pathway. It is part of how the brain is built and tuned. It also helps explain why marijuana can feel like several things at once. Because the endocannabinoid system intersects with mood, reward, appetite, pain, learning, and memory, THC can produce a blend of effects that do not always seem to belong together. A person may feel physically relaxed but mentally distractible. They may feel emotionally warmer but cognitively slower. Food may seem more appealing while short-term memory becomes less dependable. Music may feel deeper while reaction time quietly drifts. This mixture is not random. It reflects the fact that THC is engaging a regulatory system with many jobs. Need's addiction science materials note that drugs such as marijuana can activate neurons because their chemical structure mimics that of a natural neurotransmitter. Need's marijuana materials note that THC, acting through cannabinoid receptors, activates the brain's reward system as well. So the experience is not just relaxation, it is altered signaling across multiple circuits that normally help decide what matters, what feels rewarding, what should be remembered, and how strongly the body should respond. The result can feel personal and mysterious from the inside, but the biology underneath is a bit more practical. THC is borrowing the controls of a system that was meant to regulate many parts of ordinary life. So when we ask why this system exists, the calmest answer is that the brain needs something like it. It needs a way to fine-tune communication, steady itself, adapt to changing demands, and protect its own flexibility. It needs short-lived internal messengers that can say slow down here, ease up there, adjust this circuit, soften that signal, and help keep the whole operation from becoming too rigid or too unstable. That is the system THC meets It does not create it. It hijacks it, imitates part of its language, and then pushes on controls that were designed for brief, local, carefully timed messages. Once you see that, marijuana looks less like a mysterious plant that somehow casts a spell on the brain, and more like an outside chemical stepping into one of the brain's own balancing networks. And once that outside signal starts leaning on memory circuits, stress circuits, sensory filters, and reward pathways all at once, it becomes much easier to understand why time changes, why recall becomes slippery, why food becomes unusually appealing, why calm can tip into unease, and why repeated exposure can teach the brain to adapt in ways it did not originally plan for. That brings us naturally to what people notice next, because after THC meets the system, perception itself begins to shift, and the ordinary world starts feeling a little less ordinary. What changes first is not reality itself, but the way your brain ranks reality. The room is still the room, the clock is still the clock, the song still lasts the same number of minutes. But the system doing the sorting has shifted, and that is why time, sound, thought, and sensation can all begin to feel unusually different under THC. Official public health guidance is quite plain about this. Recent cannabis use has immediate effects on thinking, attention, memory, coordination, movement, and time perception. Anita also notes short-term effects such as altered senses, altered time perception, impaired thinking, and changes in mood. That list is useful because it explains why the experience can feel so broad. THC is not just touching one mood switch marked calm. It is affecting the brain functions that help decide what deserves your attention, how long a moment seems to last, how cleanly one thought leads to the next, and how confidently you can trust your own impressions. That is why the high can feel like several things at once. It may be relaxing and distracting. It may be funny and confusing. It may make a quiet room feel richer, or a busy room feel like far too much room all at once. The altered perception is not a decorative side effect floating on top of the experience. In many ways, it is the experience. The brain is still receiving the world, but it is now receiving it through changed timing, changed filtering, and changed judgment about what matters most right now. Time is one of the strangest examples because it is so familiar and so easy to notice. People often describe cannabis as making 10 minutes feel much longer, or making an evening disappear in a soft blur, and oddly enough, both descriptions can be true depending on what the brain is doing with attention. NIDA explicitly lists altered time perception as a short-term effect, and CDC says recent use has an immediate impact on time perception. One sensible way to understand that is that the brain is no longer measuring experience with its usual confidence. When attention becomes less stable, moments can stop flowing together as neatly. A pause in conversation may feel stretched. Waiting for the kettle, the microwave, or the delivery driver can become a surprisingly detailed event. At the same time, an entire hour can vanish, because the brain was not tracking it cleanly as a continuous line. So the user is not necessarily becoming a philosopher of time. More often, the internal bookkeeping is getting messy. Seconds may feel louder, minutes may feel softer. A thought may take so long to unfold from the inside that the outside world seems to have slowed down to be polite. And then later, the same person may look at the clock and realise that the evening moved much faster than it felt, while they were busy inspecting one very important idea about toast, socks, or the emotional meaning of a lamp. The clock does not move differently. The brain's sense of duration does. Sound and sensation begin to change for a similar reason. NIDA's educational materials say marijuana changes brain messages that alter sensory perception and coordination, which can affect how users see, hear, and feel stimuli. And they also give the simple example of altered senses such as seeing brighter colours. That does not mean cannabis turns the world into a fantasy film. Most of the time, the shift is subtler and more ordinary than that. Music may seem fuller, as though the layers inside it have moved closer together. A fabric may feel more noticeable on the skin. The coolness of a glass, the softness of a blanket, the background sound of a fan, the weight of the body against a chair, all of that can become more present than usual. One reason people can find the experience pleasant is that familiar things may suddenly seem less filtered and more immediate. The brain normally edits huge amounts of sensory information so you can get on with your day without being overwhelmed by every tiny texture and hum in the room. Under THC, some of that editing appears to loosen. The result can feel rich, amusing, or strangely intimate. It can also become irritating if the setting is already noisy, or if the person was hoping their own mind would be less noticeable rather than more. The same loosened sensory filter that makes music feel immersive can make a crowded room feel like too many radios trying to be the main character. Thought itself also changes character. This is where people often say they feel deep, reflective, unusually creative, or completely lost halfway through a sentence. Those experiences are not opposites as much as they are cousins. CDC says cannabis directly affects brain functions involved in attention, decision-making, memory, learning, and reaction time, and NIDA list impaired thinking and difficulty with problem-solving among the short-term effects. That helps explain why thoughts can feel both more interesting and less reliable. Small ideas can take on unusual weight because the brain is not ranking them in the ordinary way. A simple observation may feel unusually meaningful. A joke may seem much funnier than it deserves. A passing worry may become a topic of serious internal committee review. At the same time, the structure around thought becomes less dependable. The person may start a line of reasoning with confidence and then discover that the middle has quietly wandered off without leaving a note, so the experience can feel mentally vivid without being mentally precise. That distinction matters. A thought can feel important without being clear. It can feel original without being useful. It can feel profound while still being the intellectual equivalent of staring at a spoon and deciding it may have a backstory. This is not because THC grants wisdom and nonsense in equal measure. It is because attention, judgment, and memory are all being nudged at once, and the mind becomes more impressionable to its own passing contents. That is also why mood can turn so quickly from ease into unease. A changed perception is not always a pleasant one. NIDA says cannabis can make people feel more happy or relaxed, but it can also cause altered time perception and impaired thinking, and it notes that cannabis intoxication can induce a temporary psychotic episode in some people, especially at high doses. CDC's mental health guidance says people who use cannabis are more likely to develop psychosis and describe psychosis in terms that include not knowing what is real, hallucinations, and paranoia. NIDA's teaching materials also note that high doses can produce hallucinations and delusions. This does not mean every uncomfortable experience is psychosis, and it certainly does not mean every user will have one. But it does explain why a person can move from calm to worry in a way that feels sudden from the inside. If time is already distorted, if sounds feel unusually vivid, if thoughts are less well organized, and if judgment is slightly off, the brain can start misreading its own experience. A harmless comment may feel loaded. A normal silence may feel suspicious. A heartbeat may feel too noticeable. A person may begin monitoring themselves so closely that the monitoring becomes the problem. Once that happens, altered perception stops feeling interesting and starts feeling intrusive. The world has not become threatening in some objective new way. The brain has become less trustworthy in how it interprets what is happening. Dose and context shape almost everything about that turn. Public health sources repeatedly stress that cannabis effects vary by product strength, route of use, and whether multiple substances are used together. CDC warns that cannabis can distort perception, slow reaction time, and impair decision-making and coordination, and it adds that using cannabis and alcohol together can increase impairment. This is one reason two people can tell completely different stories about what seems like the same drug. One person may be in a quiet room, taking a small amount, already relaxed, with little demand on their attention. Another may be in public, using a stronger product than expected, already somewhat anxious, with alcohol on board and no good place to retreat from the experience. The altered perception in those two situations is not likely to feel remotely the same. The first may notice that the music is wonderful and the sofa has finally revealed its true purpose. The second may become hyper-aware of every glance, every sound, every pause in conversation, and every beat of their own heart. THC changes the signal, but the setting tells the brain how to read that change. That is why cannabis can feel mellow in one context and mentally noisy in another. The chemistry matters, but so does the room it enters and the state of the mind that greets it. Another problem is that altered perception can hide impairment rather than announcing it. A person may feel slow in a comfortable way and mistake that for being fine, but CDC's guidance on driving is blunt. Cannabis affects the brain areas involved in movement, balance, coordination, memory, and judgment, and it can impair skills needed for safe driving by slowing reaction time, impairing coordination, and distorting perception. That last point is easy to underestimate because distorted perception does not always feel dramatic. It may simply mean the brain is judging speed, distance, timing, and significance less accurately than usual. A light changes, a pedestrian hesitates, a lane narrows, another driver behaves like they have made peace with chaos. Safe driving depends on reading all of that cleanly and quickly. THC does not need to make a person obviously intoxicated to interfere. It is enough that perception is a bit off, timing is a bit slower, and judgment is a bit softer. This is one of the quiet dangers of cannabis. It can leave a person feeling subjectively steady while their perception is objectively less reliable. The mind says, "I'm calm." The road says, "That is not the same thing as ready." And roads, unfortunately, tend to be less interested in self-expression than they are in reaction time. It is also worth saying that not every altered perception under cannabis is dramatic enough to be noticed immediately. Sometimes the shift is gentle. A person becomes more inward. They listen more than they speak. Their body feels heavier. The room feels softer. They become attached to one thought longer than they normally would. They laugh more easily or drift more easily. Because the experience can begin in small ways, people often underestimate how many functions are already changing together. But CDC and NIDA keep returning to the same cluster for a reason. Attention, memory, decision-making, coordination, mood, and time perception are all part of the short-term picture. That is why the high can feel broad even when it feels mild. The person is not simply more relaxed. Their sense of what is worth noticing has changed. Their timing has changed. Their sensory weighting has changed. Their confidence in their own thoughts may remain intact even while the thoughts themselves are becoming less organized. This is part of what makes cannabis subjectively fascinating to some users. Consciousness still feels like consciousness. The narrator inside the head is still speaking in the first person. It just happens to be speaking through a brain that is no longer measuring, filtering, and prioritizing experience in quite the same way as it did half an hour earlier. So when time stretches, when sound seems closer, when a passing thought feels huge, or when an ordinary sensation suddenly becomes oddly memorable, it is not because marijuana has opened a secret chamber of reality that the sober brain cruelly keeps locked away. It is because THC has changed the way the brain handles incoming information and its own internal chatter. The system that normally filters, times, and ranks experience is working differently, and perception begins to reflect that change. Sometimes the result is pleasant, sometimes it is distracting, sometimes it tips into anxiety or confusion. But in every case, the altered perception is telling you something practical about the brain. It does not simply record the world like a camera. It edits the world, interprets it, and turns it into a usable experience. THC changes that editing process. And once that happens, One of the next things to become noticeably unreliable is not just the flavor of the moment, but the brain's ability to hold the moment in place. Because the same altered signaling that makes time and sensation feel different also begins to interfere with focus, short-term recall, and the fragile little bridge between what you were just thinking and what you are trying to say now. One of the easiest ways to notice marijuana affecting the brain is not through some dramatic hallucination or sudden personality shift. It is through a quieter failure that most people recognize immediately. A thought begins, gathers a little speed, and then slips. A sentence starts confidently and ends somewhere in the weeds because the middle vanished. You walk into the kitchen with purpose, open a cabinet, and then stand there with the expression of someone who has arrived for a meeting but cannot remember the agenda. That small, oddly familiar disruption is one of the clearest short-term effects of cannabis. The CDC says recent cannabis use, defined there as within 24 hours, has an immediate impact on thinking, attention, memory, coordination, movement, and time perception. And NIDA notes that THC-containing cannabis products can impair thinking and memory in the short term. That is the important distinction. Marijuana does not usually erase the whole library. It makes it harder to keep the current page open. What tends to falter first is working memory, the brain's temporary holding space for information you need right now. It is the small mental countertop where you keep the last few seconds of a conversation, the number you are about to dial, the reason you opened the fridge, or the idea you were trying to shape into words. Under ordinary conditions, attention helps keep that countertop clear enough to use. Under THC, that countertop gets crowded, slippery, and badly managed. Research summaries in the medical literature have repeatedly linked acute cannabis use with impairments in working memory, particularly in holding, manipulating, and recalling information over short spans, while official public health guidance from CDC and NIDA keeps pointing to the same immediate cluster of affected functions: attention, thinking, learning, memory, and concentration. So when a person under marijuana repeats a question they asked 3 minutes ago, forgets what they were saying halfway through saying it, or becomes passionately invested in an idea they cannot quite finish explaining, that is not laziness or comedy alone. It is a signal handling problem. The brain is producing thoughts, but it is not securing them properly long enough to use them well. Attention sits right in the middle of that problem. Memory in the moment depends on focus more than people often realize. Before the brain can store something, even briefly, it has to notice it clearly enough to mark it as worth keeping. Cannabis interferes with that first step as well. The CDC says cannabis directly affects the parts of the brain responsible for memory, learning, attention, decision-making, coordination, emotions, and reaction time. And AMHSA materials describe marijuana as affecting memory, learning, concentration, and attention, along with thinking and problem-solving. That combination explains a lot. If attention is unstable, the brain is less likely to register information cleanly. If information is not registered cleanly, memory has little to work with. This is why marijuana can make a person feel mentally busy, while simultaneously making them worse at following a simple thread. The mind is not empty, it is crowded. Thoughts, sounds, impressions, and associations may all be arriving, but the brain is less efficient at deciding which ones deserve priority. It is a little like trying to remember a phone number while someone keeps changing the radio station, adjusting the lights, and asking whether you have ever really considered the emotional life of sandwiches. The hippocampus helps explain why this happens so reliably. NIDA's educational materials have long pointed to the hippocampus as a brain region rich in cannabinoid-sensitive signaling and closely involved in learning and memory, noting that when THC attaches to receptors in the hippocampus, it interferes with memory. Other NIDA materials say THC alters how information is processed in the hippocampus and frontal cortex, brain areas involved in memory and concentration. That is a very useful way to think about the problem. Memory is not just a box where facts are dropped for later use. It is a process of selecting, organizing, and stabilizing information while it is still fresh. The hippocampus is deeply involved in that process. If THC changes how information is being processed there, then the brain may still have the raw material of the moment without doing the usual good job of turning it into something stable. That is why the disruption often feels so immediate and so ordinary. The person still sees the room, hears the joke, and starts the thought. What fails is the clean handoff from experience to usable memory. The moment arrives, but it does not settle properly. This also helps separate short-term memory problems from the broader question of intelligence, insight, or personality. A person under THC may still be clever, reflective, funny, and emotionally expressive. They may even feel more open to associations and more fascinated by their own ideas than usual. But fascination is not the same thing as cognitive control. The brain may be generating plenty of material while failing to manage it efficiently. That is why cannabis can produce the peculiar combination of feeling mentally expansive while performing more poorly on tasks that depend on concentration, recall, and processing speed. Nida notes that cannabis products with THC can affect learning, memory, attention, processing speed, and perceptual motor function, and the CDC again emphasizes immediate effects on thinking, attention, and memory. This is the quiet trick marijuana can play on the user, because consciousness remains continuous. Because the inner narrator is still speaking in the first person, the person often feels essentially normal from the inside. They do not feel cognitively impaired in the dramatic way a film might suggest. They feel like themselves, just softer, slower, more interested in small details, and a little less capable of hanging on to a thought once it starts moving. Learning in real time depends on the same fragile machinery. To learn anything, the brain must take new information, hold it long enough to compare it with what is already known, and begin converting it into a more durable form. If the first step is shaky, the rest of the process becomes harder. That is one reason both public health agencies and educational materials keep linking cannabis with problems in learning as well as memory. The CDC says cannabis directly affects memory and learning functions, and CDC guidance for youth notes problems with memory and learning, difficulty maintaining attention, and difficulty thinking and problem solving. Nida's marijuana material similarly connect THC-related effects to memory and concentration. In everyday life, that does not always look dramatic. It may simply mean instructions do not land as cleanly, reading becomes less efficient, a conversation needs more repetition, or a task that usually feels straightforward begins requiring more effort than expected. The person may still understand things in broad outline. What becomes harder is building the clean little sequence by which one idea stays present long enough to connect to the next. The brain is still receiving input. It is just less reliable at turning the input into something organized enough to use. There is also a dose story inside this memory story. Not every cannabis product affects focus and recall with the same force, and not every brain reacts in the same way. The CDC says the impact on the brain depends on factors including the amount of THC in the product, how often it is used, age of first use, and whether other substances are used at the same time. That matters because memory disruption is not an all-or-nothing event. A lower dose in a quiet setting may produce only mild distractibility. A stronger product, especially in an inexperienced user or in combination with alcohol, may produce obvious confusion, looping thoughts, repeated questions, and an almost comic inability to track a simple sequence. The brain's short-term holding system is not being either fully preserved or fully destroyed. It is being stressed to varying degrees. That is one reason marijuana stories differ so much. One person says it only makes music better and snacks more persuasive. Another says it makes them forget what they are doing every 3 minutes. Both may be describing the same general mechanism under different conditions. THC is changing how well the brain can stabilize attention and hold information online. The difference is simply how much signal change the system is being asked to tolerate. Age matters here too. though this section is mostly about the immediate moment. The CDC notes that using cannabis before age 18 may affect how the brain builds connections for functions like attention, memory and learning, and says the brain continues developing until around age 25. That means the short-term memory disruption of marijuana does not happen in exactly the same context for a teenager as it does for a mature adult. In a developing brain, the systems involved in attention, memory and learning are still being tuned. So even when the immediate effect looks familiar, the larger concern is different. The same substance that makes an adult lose the thread of a conversation for an evening may be interacting with a younger brain that is still laying down patterns for how attention and memory are meant to work over time. That does not mean every young person who uses cannabis will have the same long-term outcome. The CDC is careful to note that more research is needed to fully understand lasting effects. But it does mean that short-term memory problems are not just an inconvenience in younger users. They may be a glimpse of a system being interrupted while still under construction. Frequent or heavy use can widen the issue beyond the immediate moment. NIDA says frequent or heavy cannabis use has been linked to problems in brain functions like learning and memory, attention, processing speed, and perceptual motor function. And CDC notes that long-term effects on attention, memory and learning may last a long time or even be permanent, especially with earlier use, although the agency also says more research is needed to fully understand those effects. That caution matters. It keeps the discussion honest. The science does not support the idea that one experience with marijuana ruins a person's mind forever. But it also does not support the breezy claim that memory disruption is just a harmless little evening quirk with no wider relevance. For some people, especially with heavier and earlier use, the pattern can extend beyond one intoxicated night. The brain adapts to what it experiences repeatedly, and repeated interference with attention and working memory is not nothing. Still, even before talking about longer patterns, the shorter one is revealing enough. When marijuana disrupts memory in the moment, it is showing you how much ordinary thinking depends on the brain's ability to keep a few seconds of life properly lit and properly arranged. So the memory problem under marijuana is not really about forgetting your entire life or becoming suddenly incapable of thought. It is more local than that, and in some ways more interesting. THC interferes with the systems that help the brain notice, hold, prioritize, and process what is happening right now. Attention becomes less stable. Working memory becomes less dependable. The hippocampus and related networks do a less tidy job of turning the present into something usable a few moments later. That is why a thought can feel important and still evaporate. That is why a conversation can become both funny and strangely hard work. That is why a person can feel mentally full while actually handling information less effectively. And once focus and recall start slipping in that way, the brain's emotional and reward systems begin to matter even more. Because a drifting mind does not just forget more easily. It also becomes more vulnerable to whatever feels good, soothing, interesting, or intensely worth chasing in the moment, which is where mood, dopamine, calm, and euphoria begin to enter the picture more clearly. Once focus starts slipping and short-term memory gets a little unreliable, the next thing that begins to matter more is whatever feels good right now. That is not a moral weakness, and it is not unique to marijuana. It is how the brain is built. The brain has systems for attention, systems for memory, systems for movement, and also systems for reward, motivation, and emotional tone. Those systems are constantly working together, which is why a substance that changes thought can also change mood, and why a substance that feels calming can also become something the brain quietly learns to want again. NIDA's addiction materials explain that most drugs affect the brain's reward circuit, causing euphoria and flooding the circuit with dopamine, and that large surges of dopamine teach the brain to seek drugs at the expense of other, healthier goals and activities. Public-facing NIDA materials on cannabis add that THC can cause changes in mood, thoughts, and perceptions of reality, while its current drugs A to Z materials list effects such as euphoria, a feeling of connectedness, and also fear, anxiety, and confusion. So the mood story here is never just one feeling. It is a shift in the brain's balancing act, where pleasure, calm, novelty, and emotional instability can all enter the room together. A helpful way to think about dopamine is that it is not simply the brain's little bottle of happiness. People often talk about dopamine as though it were pure pleasure in chemical form, but that is too crude to be useful. In addiction science, dopamine is better understood as part of a teaching and motivation system. It helps mark things as important, rewarding, or worth repeating. NIDA's science pages say that most drugs affect the reward circuit by flooding it with dopamine, and that these large surges help teach the brain to keep seeking the drug. Older, but still official, NIDA cannabis materials say THC stimulates neurons in the reward system to release dopamine at levels higher than typically observed. That does not mean cannabis works exactly like every other drug, or that every user is heading straight into addiction. It means the brain does not treat the experience as emotionally neutral. If THC produces a rewarding shift in mood or sensation, the brain notices. It records that the state felt meaningful, soothing, novel, funny, relieving, or desirable. And once the brain starts labeling an experience as worth repeating, the experience begins leaving tracks. That is the beginning of reinforcement, not a courtroom sentence, just a quiet bit of learning. The brain is in effect putting a small star next to the event and saying, "That changed something. Remember this." This is one reason marijuana can feel calming even while it is also impairing attention and memory. Calm and clarity are not the same thing, and the brain does not always deliver them as a pair. Some official NIDA educational materials describe THC as causing a calm euphoria, which is a useful phrase because it captures the mixture many people report. Not just happiness, not just sedation, but a softened emotional texture combined with a mild sense that things are somehow easier, warmer, more amusing, or less urgent than they were before. NIDA's current cannabis page says THC can change mood, thoughts, and perceptions of reality, and its drugs, A to Z materials, include euphoria and a feeling of connectedness among the possible effects. That combination makes sense if the brain's usual filtering and emotional weighting have shifted. A worry that felt sharp may now feel manageable. A room that felt flat may now feel welcoming. Music may feel closer. Food may seem unusually persuasive. The brain is not necessarily solving the original problem that made the person want relief. It is changing the importance and emotional flavour of what is already there. That can feel wonderful in the short term. It can also be misleading. Feeling less burdened for a while is not the same thing as having repaired the underlying stress. Sometimes the brain has simply turned the dimmer switch rather than fixed the wiring. It also helps to remember that the reward system is not built only for drugs. It is supposed to respond to ordinary life. Food when you're hungry, rest when you're exhausted, laughter in company, relief after discomfort, curiosity satisfied by something interesting. All of those are part of the brain's natural reward world. The point of the system is to help you repeat things that support survival, learning, and social life. NIDA's addiction materials make this clear when they describe dopamine surges as reinforcing behavior and shifting motivation. Marijuana does not invent the reward system, it leans on it. That is why the experience can feel so natural from the inside. The person does not usually feel as though a totally alien force has arrived and taken command. They feel as though ordinary pleasures have become louder and ordinary annoyances have become quieter. Snacks become more compelling. A blanket becomes a better blanket than any blanket has a right to be. A joke becomes not just funny, but historically significant. That familiarity is part of the drug's power. THC is not delivering an emotion the brain has never known. It is exaggerating and redirecting systems the brain already uses to decide what feels good, what feels safe, and what should keep your attention for a little longer. Still, the mood shift under marijuana is rarely one clean line from neutral to happy. It is more like a rebalancing, and sometimes a slightly messy one. Public health agencies are clear that cannabis affects emotions as well as thinking. The CDC says cannabis use directly affects the parts of the brain responsible for emotions, and the agency's mental health page says cannabis can cause disorientation and sometimes unpleasant thoughts or feelings of anxiety and paranoia. NIDA says THC-containing products can change mood, thoughts, and perceptions of reality, and its current materials also note that fear, anxiety, and confusion can occur. That means the same chemical change that gives one person a soft-edged evening can leave another person feeling awkward, over-aware, or emotionally brittle. The reward system does not operate in isolation from the rest of the brain. If the person is already tense, already self-conscious, already carrying a lot of inner noise, the altered state can magnify that rather than quiet it. So reward and mood under marijuana are not just about pleasure arriving, they are about balance shifting, a little more ease in one circuit, a little less control in another, a little more salience attached to passing thoughts, and suddenly the emotional weather inside the head can become harder to predict than the person expected when they first thought, "This should help me relax." Dose is one of the main reasons that balance can swing so differently. The CDC says the impact of cannabis on the brain depends on several factors, including the amount of THC in the product, how often it is used, age of first use, and whether other substances such as alcohol are used at the same time. NIDA's current cannabis page also notes that anxiety, fear, distrust, panic, or hallucinations are more common when a person takes a large amount, when the product has unexpectedly high THC, or when the person has a little experience with cannabis. That tells you something important about the reward side of the story. A low or moderate dose may tilt mood toward relaxation or mild euphoria. A stronger dose may tip the same system toward discomfort. This is not because the brain has suddenly become mysterious or moody for no reason. It is because the same circuits that can be softly modulated can also be overstimulated, and once attention, time perception, judgment, and emotional weighting are all shifting together, the experience can stop feeling cozy and start feeling unsteady. A little like turning the music up for atmosphere and discovering that at a certain point you're no longer having ambience, you're simply being shouted at by a speaker. This is also where the modern conversation about cannabis often gets confused by mixing THC and CBD together as though they tell the same mood story. They do not. NCCIH says there is a small amount of evidence from studies in people suggesting that cannabis, or cannabinoids, might help reduce anxiety, and it gives the example of a study in which people with social anxiety disorder had less anxiety in a simulated public speaking test after taking CBD than after placebo. But NCCIH is very careful about the limits of that evidence, and that finding is not the same as saying that ordinary marijuana use reliably reduces anxiety. In fact, CDC and NIDA both warn that cannabis, especially THC-rich cannabis, can also produce anxiety, paranoia, and other unpleasant mental effects. So when people say, "cannabis calms me down," they may be describing a real subjective experience, but that statement does not automatically translate into a general brain rule. Product composition matters, dose matters, situation matters. A CBD-heavy preparation studied in a narrow research context is not the same thing as a high THC edible taken casually on a Friday night. The mood result may be very different, even though people use the same broad word cannabis for both. And the brain, annoyingly but sensibly, cares much more about chemistry than branding. There is another reason dopamine matters here, and it has less to do with feeling good in the moment than with what happens afterward. NIDA's addiction pages explain that dopamine surges teach the brain to seek drugs, and that cues in daily life can become linked to drug use. That learning process is easy to underestimate with cannabis because the experience can feel gentle, domestic, and almost ordinary. But ordinary is exactly what makes the associations easy to build. A certain chair, a certain time of evening, a certain playlist, a certain group of friends, the end of work, the start of a weekend, boredom, stress, loneliness, celebration, Food delivery, even the sound of a grinder or the sight of a package in a drawer, all of these can become tied to the expectation of relief or reward. The brain does not need a dramatic life collapse to begin learning those links. It only needs repetition. If a person repeatedly uses marijuana to shift mood, take the edge off stress, make boredom more tolerable, or make pleasure feel fuller, the reward system starts knitting those contexts together. That does not mean every repeated user has a disorder. It means the brain is doing exactly what a learning brain does. It is connecting feelings, places, and routines with a chemically reinforced change in state. And once that starts happening, mood is no longer just something marijuana changes. Mood can become one of the reasons the brain starts reaching for marijuana in the first place. For some people, that repeated shift in mood can become especially appealing because it seems to offer a shortcut around discomfort. Stress feels less sharp. Social awkwardness feels more manageable. A dull evening becomes easier to sit through. That is easy to understand on a human level. But it also means the brain may begin relying on an outside signal to do work it would otherwise have to do more slowly on its own. And the problem with shortcuts in the reward system is that the brain learns them quickly. NIDA's general addiction science makes this point without needing to single out cannabis as uniquely dangerous. When drugs repeatedly produce rewarding dopamine signals, the brain can begin prioritizing them over healthier goals and habits. With cannabis, that process may look less dramatic than with some other drugs, but the basic learning principle still applies. A person may not wake up one morning transformed into a villainous cautionary tale with a tragic soundtrack. More often, they simply notice that relaxation feels harder without it, that fun seems flatter without it, or that boredom suddenly seems much more insulting than it used to. Those are not always signs of addiction by themselves, but they are signs that mood and reward have started forming a pattern together. And this is where the brain's shifting balance becomes most interesting, and for some people, most uncomfortable. The same system that can make a person feel easy, amused, and pleasantly detached can also leave them emotionally unsteady when the conditions are wrong. The CDC says cannabis can cause disorientation and unpleasant thoughts or feelings of anxiety and paranoia, and that people who use cannabis are more likely to develop psychosis and long-lasting mental disorders, with the association being stronger in those who start younger and use more frequently. NIDA's cannabis materials likewise note that changes in mood, thoughts, and perceptions of reality can include anxiety, fear, distrust, panic, or hallucinations, especially with larger amounts or unexpectedly potent products. So reward and mood are not separate lanes in the marijuana story. They are part of the same road. The early calm, the soft euphoria, the sense of connectedness, the laughter, the relief, the interest in food, music, and idle thoughts, all of that lives very close to the possibility that the same altered emotional weighting can begin to feel wrong. A thought that felt pleasantly interesting can become sticky. A feeling of inwardness can become self-consciousness. A heightened sensitivity can stop feeling rich and start feeling threatening. That turn is one of the most important parts of the whole picture, because it shows that the brain is not just being rewarded under THC, it is being destabilized and soothed at the same time, and which side becomes more obvious depends on dose, setting, experience, age, and the state of mind the person brought with them into the room. That is why, once the calm starts shifting and the mood no longer feels entirely trustworthy, the story moves naturally into a more uneasy place, where relief and paranoia can end up standing much closer together than most people expect. There is a moment in some cannabis experiences when the whole thing changes character. It may begin gently enough. The body feels looser. Thoughts feel softer around the edges. Music sounds a little richer. Time becomes less strict. Nothing seems especially wrong. In fact, that early phase is often exactly why people reach for marijuana in the first place. They want relief, distance from stress, a little quieting of the day. But then, without much warning, the same altered state that felt cozy begins to feel unstable. A passing thought sticks. A harmless sound seems unusually sharp. Someone's ordinary expression across the room starts to look meaningful for no good reason. The person becomes aware of their own awareness in a way that is not relaxing at all. The calm has not simply vanished, it has turned uneasy. This shift is not imaginary, and it is not rare enough to dismiss as some strange exception. The CDC says cannabis use can cause disorientation, and sometimes unpleasant thoughts or feelings of anxiety and paranoia, while NIDA says THC-containing cannabis products can bring anxiety, fear, distrust, panic, or hallucinations, especially when someone takes a large amount, uses a product with unexpectedly high THC, or has little experience with cannabis. That is an important point because it means the uneasy turn is part of the known short-term picture, not just a bad story told by the unlucky few. One reason the experience can change so quickly is that marijuana does not simply add calm to the brain like a warm blanket dropped over a chair. It changes how the brain interprets what is happening, and that includes your own internal state. Earlier in the experience, the altered perception may feel pleasant. Sound seems fuller, time seems slower, attention narrows in an almost dreamy way. But those same changes can become unsettling once the brain begins monitoring itself too closely. If time already feels stretched, then a few uneasy seconds can feel far longer than they are. If attention is already narrowed, then the mind may become trapped with one concern instead of moving past it. If ordinary sensations are already louder, then a racing heart, a dry mouth, or the sudden feeling of being watched can become much more significant than they deserve. This is one of the quiet tricks of THC. It does not always produce anxiety by inserting a brand new fear into the brain. Sometimes it simply takes a small discomfort and gives it too much stage lighting. NIDA's cannabis materials note that THC can change mood, thoughts, and perceptions of reality, while the CDC notes not only anxiety and paranoia, but also disorientation. That combination explains why a person can feel as though something important and vaguely wrong is happening, even when the outside situation has not changed very much at all. This is also why setting matters so much. People often talk about cannabis as though it produces one standard experience independent of the room, the people, or the emotional tone of the evening. But the brain does not meet THC in a vacuum. It meets it in a context. A quiet room, a familiar sofa, trusted company, low stimulation, and no pressure to perform socially may allow the altered state to feel manageable, even pleasant. A crowded room, bright lights, strangers, too much noise, unresolved stress, or the uncomfortable suspicion that everyone else seems more composed than you do, can turn the same chemistry into something far more difficult. Because THC affects attention, mood, memory, and perception all at once, the mind becomes more sensitive to the meaning it assigns to its surroundings. A harmless pause in conversation can feel awkward. A laugh across the room can feel personal. A small uncertainty can start asking for a full investigation. The drug has not changed the laws of reality. It has changed how confidently the brain reads reality. NIDA's educational materials for cannabis describe paranoia and panic as possible effects, particularly after taking a lot of cannabis, and the CDC says unpleasant thoughts or feelings of anxiety and paranoia can happen during use. That means the room itself becomes part of the experience. The setting does not merely host the altered state, it helps shape it. Dose is one of the biggest reasons the mood can tilt from ease into distress. Low or moderate intoxication may feel manageable. Stronger intoxication may not. This is partly because the very systems that create the pleasant side of the experience can become unstable when pushed too far. A little softening of perception may feel interesting. Too much can feel disorienting. A little inward focus may feel reflective. Too much can feel trapped. A little emotional looseness may feel relieving. Too much can start to resemble a mind no longer trusting its own signals. NIDA states that anxiety, fear, distrust, Panic or hallucinations are more common when a person takes a large amount, when the product has unexpectedly high THC, or when the person has little experience with cannabis. That is worth taking seriously, especially now that product potency can vary so much. People often use a very old-fashioned cultural image of marijuana in their minds, something mild, leafy and sleepy, while the actual product in front of them may be much stronger than that image suggests. The brain does not care about nostalgia, it responds to concentration, and once THC levels rise beyond what the person expected, the experience can stop feeling like a gentle detour and start feeling like the floor is tilted in a way no one warned them about. Edibles deserve special mention here because they create a particularly good setup for this uneasy turn. When cannabis is eaten rather than inhaled, the timing is slower and more deceptive. The person may feel almost nothing for a while, assume the dose was weak and then take more. Or they may sit through that delay growing uncertain, wondering whether anything is happening at all, only to have the effects arrive later and more strongly than expected. That delayed arrival can be unsettling by itself, because uncertainty makes the brain more likely to monitor internal sensations closely. Then, when the full effect finally appears, it is often stronger and longer lasting than the person had planned for. NECCIH highlighted a study showing that orally consumed THC, especially when co-administered with CBD in high doses, produced stronger drug effects including self-reported anxiety, sedation, memory difficulty, worse cognitive and psychomotor function, and greater increases in heart rate. That is a useful reminder that edible is not just another way to consume the same experience. It can be a different emotional experience altogether because the onset is delayed, the effects can be prolonged, and the person may feel as though the experience is happening to them rather than arriving with them. A fast-moving worry can become much harder to settle when the drug itself seems to have no interest in leaving on schedule. There is also a more serious edge to this topic that should be spoken about plainly. Anxiety and paranoia during cannabis use are one thing. Psychosis is another. The CDC says people who use cannabis are more likely to develop temporary psychosis and long-lasting mental disorders, including schizophrenia, and it specifically describes psychosis in terms of not knowing what is real, hallucinations and paranoia. The association is stronger in people who start using earlier and in those who use more frequently. NEDA echoes that cannabis products with THC can cause changes in perceptions of reality and in some cases hallucinations. That does not mean every anxious experience on marijuana is a psychotic episode, and it does not mean every person who uses cannabis is heading towards schizophrenia. It does mean the uneasy turn exists on a spectrum. For many people it may stop at racing thoughts, distrust, or feeling socially exposed. For others, particularly at high doses or with underlying vulnerability, it can move further into a state where reality itself becomes less stable. That is one reason the phrase "it just makes you chill" is too simple to be trusted. A substance that can alter thoughts, perception, and emotional weighting can also, under the wrong conditions, push the brain into much more disturbing territory than the user expected when they first thought the evening would simply become more relaxed. Why one person laughs and another spirals is partly a question of vulnerability. The brain that meets THC is never just a brain in the abstract. It is a specific person's brain, carrying their baseline anxiety, their stress level, their habits of thought, their sleep, their social comfort, their expectations, and their personal sensitivity to altered states. If someone already tends to scan the room for signs of judgment, cannabis may give that scanning more intensity. If someone is already carrying stress they have not had time to process, the altered state may make that stress feel louder rather than softer. If someone is new to cannabis, every shift in perception may feel more surprising, and surprise is not always calming. NEDA explicitly notes that negative reactions such as panic and distrust are more common in people new to the drug or taking a larger amount, while the CDC highlights stronger associations with more frequent use and younger age for more serious mental health outcomes. So the changing experience is not random, even when it feels random from the inside. It reflects the meeting point between chemistry and temperament. THC changes the signal, but the person's own mind decides how threatening or manageable that changed signal feels. And unfortunately, the mind in an altered state is not always the best judge of itself. Another reason the uneasy phase can become so convincing is that cannabis can interfere with the brain's usual correction mechanisms. In ordinary anxiety, people often calm themselves by reality checking. They remind themselves the noise was probably nothing, the silence in the conversation was normal, the sensation in the body will pass, the worry is bigger than the evidence. But marijuana is already affecting memory, attention, and judgment. That means the mental tools normally used to steady the experience may not be working as neatly as they should. A person may keep forgetting the reassuring thought that would have helped them. They may be unable to hold the full context in mind. They may feel intensely certain that something is off while being less able to evaluate that feeling rationally. The CDC warns that cannabis directly affects the parts of the brain responsible for memory, attention, decision-making, emotions, and reaction time, and that short-term effects include changes to thinking and perception. That makes the anxious experience uniquely sticky. The person is not just frightened. They are frightened while the very systems needed to calm and orient themselves are also being disrupted. It is rather like trying to straighten a painting, while someone keeps nudging both the frame and the wall. There is an odd social side to all this as well. Cannabis is often culturally framed as easy, mellow, and a little humorous. Because of that, people who become anxious on it sometimes feel as though they are the one part of the evening that has gone wrong. Everyone else seems fine. Everyone else seems unbothered. The person may become embarrassed about being uneasy, which only adds another layer of self-consciousness. They are no longer just anxious. They are anxious about appearing anxious. That alone can turn mild discomfort into something more intense. NIDA's materials for parents and educators specifically note feelings such as fear, distrust, and panic, while CDC describes anxiety and paranoia during use. Those official descriptions are useful not only medically but socially, because they remind us that an uneasy cannabis experience is not some bizarre personal failure. It is a documented effect. The brain under THC can become more vulnerable to suspicious thinking, distorted emotional weighting, and discomfort with ambiguity. In that sense, the person who suddenly feels odd, exposed, or overaware is not breaking the rules of the drug. They're running into one of the rules many people prefer not to advertise when the substance is being sold as purely calming. It is also important to notice that the line between relief and unease can become thinner with repetition for some users, not thicker. People sometimes assume that more familiarity guarantees a smoother time, and sometimes that is true in a narrow sense. A person who has used cannabis many times may be less startled by the altered state, but repeated use can also mean higher doses, stronger products, and a brain that has begun adapting to the pattern. The CDC says the association between cannabis and schizophrenia is stronger in people who start earlier and use more frequently, and it also links cannabis use with depression, social anxiety, and suicidality. NIDA's general addiction science explains that drugs can teach the brain to keep seeking them, but that does not mean the emotional result remains consistently pleasant. A pattern can develop where marijuana is used to avoid discomfort, but the altered state itself becomes less reliably comforting over time. Then the person is in a more complicated relationship with the drug. They are not simply using it for pleasure. They may be using it to escape unease while also risking more unease during the experience itself. That is part of what makes the subject so human and so difficult. The same thing that seemed to help can begin contributing to the atmosphere it was supposed to relieve. So when calm turns uneasy, it is not because marijuana has suddenly become a different substance halfway through the evening. It is because the very brain changes that can feel warm, funny, and relieving. In one phase can feel disorienting, suspicious, and difficult in another. THC changes perception, attention, memory, mood, and judgment all at once. If the dose is high, the product stronger than expected, the setting uncomfortable, the mind already vulnerable, or the person inexperienced, that altered state can start feeding anxiety instead of softening it. The result may be a passing wave of discomfort, a period of paranoia, or in more serious cases, a temporary loss of contact with what is real. And once you see that, another question begins to matter more than it did at the start of the evening. Not just why the experience changes, but why some brains are more vulnerable to that change than others, especially brains that are still developing and still learning how to build stable connections in the first place. A young brain does not meet marijuana in the same way an older brain does, and that difference matters more than people sometimes like to admit. It is easy to talk about cannabis as though the only real variable is how much someone takes, or how often, or whether the evening was pleasant or strange. But age changes the whole context. The adolescent and young adult brain is not simply an adult brain with fewer birthdays behind it. It is still under construction. The CDC says the teen brain is actively developing and continues to develop until around age 25, and NIDA's educational materials explain that the prefrontal cortex, the region involved in thinking, planning, decision-making and self-control, is one of the last parts of the brain to mature. That means the systems most important for judgment, emotional regulation, impulse control, and long-range thinking are still being tuned during the very years when many people first experiment with marijuana. So when THC changes signaling in that setting, it is not just interrupting a finished system for a few hours. It may be interfering with a system that is still deciding how it wants to wire itself for the long term. That is the first thing to keep in mind when people casually compare teenage use to adult use, as though the difference were only a matter of body size or personal maturity. Development is not cosmetic. During adolescence and young adulthood, the brain is constantly strengthening some connections and pruning others. NIDA's teacher materials say that when people begin using marijuana as teenagers, while the brain is still developing, the drug can impair thinking, memory and learning functions, and affect how the brain builds connections between regions necessary for those functions. SAMHSA. Materials make a similar point in plainer language, describing the young brain as intensively shaped and reshaped by experience from the early teen years into the 20s. That means habits, stimulation, stress, sleep, learning and substance exposure can all leave a bigger mark than they might later on. Marijuana does not arrive in a neutral season. It arrives in a season when the brain is still practicing how to become itself, and if a chemical repeatedly changes how attention, memory and reward circuits are working during that season, the question is not just whether the person feels different tonight. The question is whether the brain is learning from those altered patterns while it is still setting some of its long-term defaults. That is why official guidance tends to use careful but serious language around youth use. The CDC says cannabis used during adolescence and young adulthood may harm the developing brain, and it lists negative effects in teens that include difficulty thinking and problem solving, problems with memory and learning, reduced coordination, difficulty maintaining attention, and problems with school and social life. NIDA's educational materials say much the same thing, noting that marijuana affects brain development and can impair thinking, memory, and learning. None of that means every young person who tries marijuana will instantly become unable to function, nor does it mean one experience writes destiny in permanent ink. But it does mean the short-term effects we have already talked about, the distractibility, the drifting attention, the weaker short-term recall, the softer judgment, matter differently in a younger brain. In an adult, those effects may be an interruption. In a developing brain, they may be an interruption happening while the system is still figuring out how well it can focus, how efficiently it can learn, and how strongly it should connect certain behaviours with reward and relief. School is one of the places where this difference becomes visible. Because school depends so heavily on exactly the functions cannabis can disturb, you need attention that lasts beyond the first few minutes, working memory that holds a sentence in place while the next sentence arrives, judgment that knows when to keep going and when to review, and motivation that can tolerate boredom without needing immediate relief. The CDC notes that compared with teens who do not use cannabis, teens who use cannabis are more likely to quit high school or not get a college degree, and it also lists problems with school and social life among the negative effects of teen use. That does not prove that cannabis is the sole cause of every educational difficulty. Real lives are rarely so cleanly arranged. Stress at home, mental health issues, poverty, sleep, trauma, other substance use, and a dozen other factors also shape academic outcomes. But it does tell us something important. Marijuana does not enter a young life as a harmless little side hobby floating above everything else. It tends to interact with the very capacities school and growing independence require. And because the effects on memory, attention, and motivation can be subtle at first, people may underestimate how much friction they are adding to a stage of life that already asks a lot from the brain every day. Mood and mental health are another place where age changes the story. The CDC says cannabis use has been linked to a range of mental health problems, such as depression and social anxiety, and it says people who use cannabis are more likely to develop temporary psychosis and long-lasting mental disorders including schizophrenia. It adds that the association between cannabis and schizophrenia is stronger in people who start using cannabis at an earlier age and use cannabis more frequently. That last part matters because it moves the conversation away from simple panic and toward actual pattern. Early use and more frequent use appear to matter more. The brain that is still developing seems to be more vulnerable, especially when exposure becomes regular rather than occasional. That does not mean marijuana causes psychosis in everyone who uses it young. It means vulnerability and exposure interact. A younger brain may have less room to absorb repeated distortion in perception, mood, and thinking without consequences, particularly in people already inclined toward mental health difficulties. So when calm turns uneasy in a teenager or young adult, the concern is not only that the evening has gone badly, it is also that repeated altered states in a developing brain may not be as easily shrugged off as the culture sometimes suggests. The reward side of the story is different in young people too, and perhaps more important than it first appears. NIDA's addiction science materials explain that the reward circuit, stress circuit, and prefrontal control systems are all involved in substance use, and that the prefrontal cortex is the last to mature, which makes teens more vulnerable to the effects of drugs. The same NIDA materials on marijuana say that people who begin using marijuana before age 18 are more likely than adults to develop a marijuana use disorder, while the CDC says the risk of developing cannabis use disorder is greater in people who start during youth or adolescence and who use more frequently. That makes intuitive sense once you stop imagining drug use as a series of isolated evenings and start imagining it as learning. A young brain is especially good at learning from reward, repetition, and relief. If marijuana repeatedly becomes the thing that makes boredom easier, stress softer, music better, social anxiety quieter, or sleep more reachable, then the brain can begin building that pattern while its self-control systems are still maturing. The result is not always dramatic right away. More often, it's a quiet drift in what the brain starts expecting from ordinary life. Potency makes that young brain question even more pressing. The Surgeon General's advisory warns that highly potent products and concentrates are more widely available now, and that risks of dependence, addiction, and other negative consequences increase with high concentrations of THC and with younger age of initiation. The advisory also notes that higher doses of THC are more likely to produce anxiety, agitation, paranoia, and psychosis. The CDC's current cannabis use disorder page adds that products with high concentrations of THC can have greater intoxicating effects and increase the risk of overconsumption, and it says there is moderate evidence that high THC cannabis used by adolescents and young adults is associated with continued use and future mental health symptoms and disorders. That means the old cultural script of mild marijuana and lazy giggling is not always a good guide to the products young people may actually encounter. A developing brain exposed to stronger THC is not just meeting the same old story with a modern package. It may be meeting a much heavier signal than previous generations imagine when they hear the word marijuana, and that stronger signal can push memory, perception, mood, and reward systems harder than the person expected. It is also worth being honest about uncertainty, because this is one of those topics where exaggeration is tempting and not very useful. NIDA's educational materials note that drawing definitive conclusions about marijuana's long-term impact on the human brain can be difficult, because study participants often use multiple substances, and researchers do not always have detailed information about health and mental functioning before marijuana use began. That is an important caveat. It keeps us from turning a real concern into a cartoon. The evidence does not support saying that every difference seen in every study was caused by cannabis and cannabis alone. Life is messier than that. At the same time, uncertainty about exact size of effect is not the same thing as lack of concern. The consistency of official guidance from CDC, NIDA, and the Surgeon General is clear. The developing brain is more vulnerable. Early and frequent use raise the stakes, and the functions most often affected are the very ones young people rely on for learning, self-control, planning, and mental health. So the honest position is neither panic nor dismissal. It is caution with a straight face. One of the quiet tragedies in this subject is that young people often use marijuana for reasons that make immediate sense. A CDC report on adolescents entering substance use treatment found that common reasons for substance use included wanting to feel mellow or calm, experimenting, and coping with stress. That is deeply human. A developing brain lives in a period of intense emotion, social uncertainty, changing identity, academic pressure, shifting sleep patterns, and an almost unfair amount of self-consciousness. It is not surprising that relief becomes attractive. The problem is that the same brain-seeking relief is also more susceptible to learning the pattern too well. If marijuana becomes the easy answer to stress, boredom, awkwardness, loneliness, or restlessness, then the brain may begin practicing dependence on that answer before it has fully developed the adult circuitry that supports self-regulation and long-range decision-making. A person may think they are just getting through high school, college, or early adulthood a little more comfortably. Meanwhile, the brain may be learning that discomfort should be outsourced chemically whenever possible, and once that lesson starts settling in, it becomes much harder to tell where coping ends and adaptation begins. So when we say marijuana affects young minds differently, we are really saying several things at once. We are saying that the brain is still developing into the mid-20s. We are saying that THC can disrupt attention, memory, learning, and judgment in systems that are still being shaped. We are saying that early and frequent use are linked to greater risk of cannabis use disorder and stronger associations with mental health problems, including psychosis-related outcomes in vulnerable people. We are saying that stronger products raise the stakes, and we're also saying something quieter but just as important. The developing brain learns from repetition with extraordinary efficiency. Whatever it practices, it becomes better at. If it practices focused learning, it strengthens that. If it practices avoiding discomfort through a repeated chemical shortcut, it can strengthen that too. That is why youth use is not best understood as a smaller version of adult use. It is a different biological situation altogether. And once repeated exposure begins teaching the brain how to adjust itself around THC, the next question is no longer only what marijuana does in the moment, but what the brain starts doing in response over time. Because no brain likes being pushed in the same direction repeatedly without beginning to push back. The brain is patient, but it is not passive. If THC arrives once in a while, the experience may feel like an interruption, a temporary rearranging of time, memory, mood, and sensation before the system finds its footing again. But if THC arrives often enough, the brain does what brains always do with repeated experience. It adapts. That is one of the quietest and most important truths in this whole subject. Repetition teaches the nervous system. It learns the signal, adjusts to it, and starts building a new version of normal around it. The CDC says some people who use cannabis go on to develop cannabis use disorder, and that risk is greater in people who start during youth or adolescence and in people who use more frequently. It also notes that needing to use more cannabis to get the same high is one of the signs of cannabis use disorder. That is tolerance in plain clothes. The substance has not necessarily become weaker. The brain has become less impressed by the same dose because it has begun adapting to the repeated presence of THC. Tolerance can sound like a harmless little detail, almost like becoming too familiar with a favourite song. But biologically it is more interesting than that. It means the system is no longer meeting THC as a surprise. The National Academy's review on cannabis describes prolonged CB1 receptor occupation from sustained cannabis use as triggering desensitization and leading to tolerance, and it notes that repeated THC exposure in animals decreases CB1 receptor levels and impairs receptor signaling. The same review says imaging studies in humans have shown downregulation of CB1 receptors in chronic cannabis users, and that this change can reverse with abstinence. In other words, the brain does not merely shrug and carry on. It changes receptor responsiveness, and in some regions even changes receptor availability as part of learning how to live with repeated THC. That is why a dose that once felt strong can later feel ordinary, and why some people begin using more stronger products or more frequent doses to recapture the same effect that used to arrive with less effort. This is where repetition starts changing the emotional meaning of marijuana as well. Early on, a person may use cannabis and think of it mostly in terms of the immediate feeling. Calmer, lighter, sleepier, funnier, less bothered, more interested in music, food, or the texture of the evening. But as tolerance develops, the relationship can shift. The goal is no longer always to feel especially good. Sometimes it becomes simply to feel normal, or to avoid feeling irritable, restless, or flat. NIDA's addiction science materials explain that repeated drug use can alter brain circuits involved in reward stress, learning and self-control, and that large dopamine-related reward signals teach the brain to keep seeking the drug. Those materials also note that cues in daily life can become linked to drug use and trigger craving. That is how the pattern becomes more than chemistry. The chair, the end of the workday, the certain playlist, the walk home, the late-night boredom, the social discomfort before meeting people. All of these can become part of the learned routine. The brain is not just adapting to THC, it is adapting to the entire ritual around THC. That learning process is one reason dependence can sneak up on people who never imagine themselves as the type. Cannabis does not always announce itself with the sort of dramatic collapse people associate with addiction in films. Often the change is quieter. A person notices that evenings feel duller without it. Food seems less appealing without it. Stress feels sharper without it. Falling asleep feels harder without it. Social awkwardness feels more noticeable without it. Over time, the brain begins treating the drug less like an occasional event and more like part of the environment. The CDC describes cannabis use disorder as being unable to stop using cannabis even though it is causing health and social problems, and its signs include using more than intended, trying and failing to quit, spending a lot of time using, craving cannabis, using despite problems at home, school or work, giving up important activities, and continuing to use despite physical or psychological problems. Those are not signs of moral weakness. They are signs that the pattern has become organized enough in the brain and in daily life that it is no longer entirely under easy voluntary control. It is worth pausing here, because the word dependence can frighten people into hearing more than is being said. Dependence in this context does not have to mean a life immediately falling apart in public view. It means the brain has adapted enough that stopping is no longer neutral. NIDA's current cannabis materials say that some people who use cannabis may develop a cannabis use disorder, and that withdrawal symptoms can include irritability, anger and aggression, feelings of nervousness or anxiety, restlessness, decreased appetite or weight loss, depression, sleep problems, and strange dreams. NIDA's withdrawal symptom checklist includes a similar group of symptoms, including craving, irritability, nervousness, depression, anger, restlessness, sleep problems, decreased appetite, strange dreams, and headaches. That list tells you something very simple and very human. Repeated cannabis use can teach the brain to expect THC, and when THC is absent, the system can react. The person is not imagining the rough edge. The balance has shifted, and now the absence of the familiar signal is being felt as a problem to solve. Sleep is often where people notice this most clearly, because sleep makes routines visible in a way daylight sometimes hides. A person may begin by using marijuana because it seems to quiet the mind or make bedtime easier. Then after regular use, a night without it feels strangely exposed. They lie there waiting for the usual soft landing and discover the brain has become less cooperative than it used to be. NIDA's cannabis materials list sleep problems and strange dreams among withdrawal symptoms, and the same withdrawal checklist includes both sleep problems and strange dreams as common features people report when stopping. That matters because it changes the emotional story of use. What once felt like a choice to unwind can begin to feel like maintenance. The person may tell themselves they're using cannabis to sleep better, but part of what may be happening is that the brain has learned to expect cannabis before sleep and protests when the routine is interrupted. The line between relief and restoration becomes much blurrier once the drug is helping solve a discomfort that repeated use helped create. High THC products can make this adaptation story sharper. The CDC says products with high concentrations of THC can have greater intoxicating effects and increase the risk of overconsumption, and it notes that THC concentrations in cannabis products have risen over the past few decades, with many dispensary products offering much higher concentrations than older samples. It also says there is moderate evidence that high THC cannabis used by adolescents and young adults is associated with continued use and with later mental health symptoms and disorders. That is important because tolerance is not just about time, it is also about signal strength. A brain repeatedly exposed to stronger THC is being asked to adapt to a bigger push. And once stronger products become part of the routine, the distance between a little to relax and more than intended can shrink without the user fully noticing. The old cultural image of cannabis as something mild and sleepy is not always a good guide to the products modern users are actually teaching their brains to expect. There is a quiet irony in the way tolerance and dependence can change the original purpose of use. Many people begin with marijuana because they want to reduce friction in life. They want to feel less anxious, less tense, less bored, less mentally crowded. But as the brain learns the pattern, the drug can gradually become tied not only to pleasure, but to relief from the discomfort of not using. NIDA's addiction science pages explain that repeated drug exposure affects not only reward but also stress circuits and self-control systems. That is why dependence is not just a reward story, it is also a stress story. The brain can start to feel more irritable, more restless, or less settled when the expected signal does not arrive. Then use no longer feels like reaching upward for a better mood. It can start to feel like patching a leak. And because the patch works in the short term, the pattern strengthens. The brain learns once again, very efficiently, that this is how the discomfort gets managed. That is how routine becomes reinforcement, and how reinforcement becomes habit with a chemical backbone. None of this means every repeated user will develop severe problems, and it is worth keeping that straight. The CDC says some people who use cannabis will develop cannabis use disorder, not everyone. Though it also notes that approximately 3 in 10 people who use cannabis have cannabis use disorder, and that people who use cannabis have about 30% likelihood of becoming addicted. it repeats that risk is greater with earlier age of initiation and more frequent use. That is a useful middle ground between two bad stories. The story that marijuana is totally harmless and the story that every use ends the same way. The real picture is more ordinary and therefore in some ways more important. The brain learns patterns. Repeated THC exposure can lead to tolerance. Repeated use can make the routine emotionally and behaviorally meaningful. Some users begin using more than intended, needing more for the same effect, craving it, or finding that stopping brings irritability, sleep trouble, restlessness, or strange dreams. The problem is not that the brain is weak. The problem is that the brain is very good at adapting, even when the thing it is adapting to is not especially good for it. And that is why repetition matters so much in the marijuana story. The first few experiences may seem to be about novelty, curiosity, relaxation, or belonging. But over time, the larger story becomes one of learning. The brain learns the signal. It learns the route to relief. It learns the cues that predict the drug. It learns how to soften its response through tolerance. And it learns how to complain when the pattern is interrupted. That is what adaptation looks like from the inside of a living nervous system. It is not dramatic every day. It is not always obvious. Sometimes it looks like a person who simply says they need a bit more than they used to. Sometimes it looks like someone who cannot quite understand why sleep, mood, or appetite feel off when they stop. Sometimes it looks like a life that is still functioning but increasingly organized around the expectation of cannabis being there. And once the brain has learned a pattern like that, one of the first places it shows its adjustments most clearly is at night, when the drug is absent, the reward signal fades, and sleep itself begins revealing what the brain has come to rely on. After enough repetition, the brain starts bringing THC into the night with it. That is one reason sleep becomes such a revealing part of the marijuana story. Many people use cannabis because it seems to help them settle down, switch off the day, and drift towards sleep with less resistance. In some studies involving people with other health problems such as chronic pain, PTSD or multiple sclerosis, cannabis or cannabinoids have been linked with reports of better sleep quality, fewer sleep disturbances, or less time needed to fall asleep. But official NIH guidance is careful here. NCCIH says it is uncertain whether those products improve sleep directly or whether people slept better because the symptoms of their illnesses had improved, and it also says the effects of cannabis or cannabinoids on sleep problems in people without other illnesses are uncertain. A separate NCCIH sleep review goes further and says a 2020 review found insufficient evidence to support cannabinoid therapies for treating any sleep disorder. So from the start, there is an important distinction. Feeling sleepier is not the same thing as having healthier sleep, and a substance that seems to help a person get into bed more easily is not automatically improving what happens once the lights are out. That distinction matters because sleep is not a single on-off switch. It has structure. The brain moves through different stages, and what feels restful from the inside is not always identical to what looks restorative when researchers measure sleep more closely. Recent reviews suggest cannabis is widely used as a sleep aid, especially for falling asleep and staying asleep, but the objective sleep picture is much less flattering. A 2024 review, summarized in the NIH search results, says cannabis used close to bedtime does not appear to have a beneficial impact on sleep architecture despite its popularity as a sleep aid. A 2025 study summary likewise says that a single dose of cannabinoids, particularly THC, may acutely influence sleep primarily by suppressing REM sleep. That is one reason some people report fewer dreams or quieter nights. The sleep may feel smoother because one of its usual features has been reduced. But smoother is not always deeper, and quieter is not always better. The brain under THC may feel more sedated, and sedation can be persuasive. It can make a person think, quite reasonably, that the substance must be helping. Yet the evidence so far suggests the relationship between cannabis and sleep quality is more mixed and more conditional than the bedtime reputation of marijuana would lead people to believe. Dreams are one of the easiest places to notice this change, even if people do not always realize what they are noticing. THC has been associated with reduced REM sleep, and REM is the stage most commonly linked with vivid dreaming. Reviews summarized in NIH search results note that THC decreased the number of rapid eye movements and the duration of REM sleep, while withdrawal led to increases in both. And newer work again suggests acute THC particularly suppresses REM sleep. That can produce a night that feels simpler from the inside. Fewer remembered dreams. Less of that strange 4 a.m. sensation of having just been in a very committed argument with someone you have not seen since school, only to wake and realize the argument was about a bicycle that could sing. For some people, especially those troubled by nightmares, this reduction in dream intensity may feel like relief. NCCIH notes that in a very small study, the cannabinoid nabilone was more effective than placebo for PTSD-related nightmares. But even there, the larger evidence is still limited, and the relief reported in specific medical settings should not be mistaken for a general rule that marijuana creates better sleep for everyone. Sometimes it may reduce a feature of sleep that felt unpleasant. That is not the same thing as making the whole night healthier. This is why marijuana can be so convincing as a sleep aid in the short term. It often changes the part of the evening people can feel most clearly, the struggle before sleep. If the mind feels less sharp, the body heavier, time slower, and the day a little farther away, it is very easy to conclude that sleep itself has improved. In some cases, that conclusion may even feel true for a while, but the objective findings remain mixed, and some of the stronger summaries now lean against the idea that cannabis reliably improves normal sleep architecture. A 2025 review summary reports that cannabis use appears to interfere with sleep in a predominantly negative way overall, even though some studies found subjective improvement. Another 2025 systematic review summary says cannabis administration does not consistently alter sleep duration, latency, wake time, efficiency, or sleep staging. Put more simply, the science does not support a neat bedtime fairy tale in which marijuana reliably tucks the brain in and leaves it better restored by morning. It may change how the person feels going to sleep. It may reduce dreaming by suppressing REM. It may even feel helpful in some specific conditions or for some specific users. But that is a much narrower claim than saying it improves sleep itself in a broad, dependable way. Regular use complicates the picture further, because once cannabis becomes part of the nightly routine, the brain begins adapting to that arrangement. Then sleep is no longer just a natural rhythm meeting fatigue. It is also a rhythm meeting expectation. That is where the sleep story starts folding back into tolerance and dependence. Research summaries note a bidirectional relationship. Sleep problems can drive cannabis use, and long-term cannabis use can increase the risk of sleep disturbance. NCCIH's sleep guidance already warns that the evidence for cannabinoids in sleep disorders is limited and inconsistent, while newer reviews point out that people often use cannabis for sleep, even though the underlying effects on sleep structure are unclear or unfavorable. This is one of the traps of repetition. A person may begin using marijuana because sleep feels difficult. Then, after regular use, they may find that sleep feels difficult without marijuana. From the inside, this can look like proof that the drug was helping all along. Sometimes what it is actually proving is that the brain has adapted to having the drug present at bedtime. The difference between those two explanations matters a great deal, even if at 1:20 in the morning both of them simply feel like tiredness, with a very strong opinion. When a regular user stops, the night often reveals that adaptation with surprising honesty. NIDA's marijuana withdrawal symptom checklist includes sleep problems and strange dreams among the 10 recognized withdrawal symptoms, alongside craving, irritability, nervousness, depression, anger, restlessness, decreased appetite, and headaches. Human studies summarized in the literature consistently report that during cannabis withdrawal, two of the most frequent sleep symptoms are reduced sleep duration and strange or vivid dreams. Other research summaries note increased sleep disturbances and vivid dreams during disrupted cannabis use, and older treatment protocols describe insomnia and vivid dreams as common features of cessation after regular use. This is why people often describe sleep after quitting as feeling loud. Not loud in the acoustic sense, but loud in the sense that the brain suddenly seems less willing to glide quietly into the dark. Falling asleep may take longer. Sleep may feel more broken. Dreams may return with such enthusiasm that they seem to have stored up a month's worth of nonsense and decided to deliver it all in 1 week. The person may feel tired and still unable to settle. That does not mean the brain is permanently damaged. It means the brain has been sleeping under altered conditions and is now trying to find its own rhythm again. The return of vivid dreams is especially revealing because it shows how much THC may have been muting part of the night without the user fully appreciating it. Reviews summarized in NIH search results say withdrawal is associated with increased REM measures after THC had previously reduced them. People often call this REM rebound, though what matters most in lived experience is not the term but the feeling. Sleep can become more emotionally busy, more memorable, more fractured, and sometimes more exhausting for a while. This is one reason quitting can be harder than many people expect. It is not only about craving the drug itself, it is also about trying to function while sleep temporarily feels less cooperative. And because poor sleep makes thinking slower, mood rougher, patience thinner, and stress harder to manage, the brain can start making a very practical argument for using again. Not a dramatic speech, just a quiet suggestion around bedtime. This was easier before. That is how sleep can become part of the cycle that keeps use going. The person may not be chasing euphoria anymore. They may simply be trying to avoid another restless night and another dream in which the furniture has opinions. The encouraging part, and it is worth saying because honesty should include hope as well as caution, is that adaptation is not the same thing as destiny. Human studies summarized in search results show that cannabinoid receptor downregulation associated with dependence begins to reverse after stopping and may continue improving over time, with some studies finding no significant group differences after about 4 weeks of abstinence. That does not mean every sleep problem vanishes on a tidy schedule, or that every person has the same recovery experience. It does mean the brain is capable of moving back toward its own baseline rather than remaining permanently arranged around THC. Some research in adolescents and young adults has even tracked sleep changes across several weeks of abstinence, precisely because this period matters for recovery and relapse risk. So the rougher nights after stopping are not proof that the brain cannot sleep without marijuana. More often they are proof that the brain has to relearn how to do so without the familiar external signal. That relearning can be uncomfortable and sometimes discouraging, but it is still relearning rather than ruin. The night is not broken, it is in negotiation. And because sleep is where the brain performs some of its quietest housekeeping, the way marijuana changes sleep ends up telling us something larger than bedtime itself. It tells us that the substance does not only change how a person feels while awake, it changes the rhythms by which the brain restores, resets, and even dreams. Once that happens often enough, the question stops being only whether marijuana helps someone rest. It becomes a deeper question about what it means to keep adjusting the organ through which a person thinks, feels, remembers, sleeps, and finally knows themselves at all. By the time you reach the end of a subject like this, the most important part is usually not the chemistry on its own. It is the meaning of the chemistry. Marijuana does not act on a spare part of you that can be cleanly separated from the rest. It acts on the organ through which you pay attention, remember, judge, feel, react, learn, and build a sense of what your own life is like from the inside. The CDC says cannabis directly affects the parts of the brain responsible for memory, learning, attention, decision-making, coordination, emotions, reaction time, and, in the short term, time perception, while neither notes that THC-containing cannabis products can change mood, thoughts, and perceptions of reality. Taken together, that means marijuana is not simply changing a mood for an evening. It is changing the system that turns the world into an experience and turns an experience into a memory. That is what makes the subject more serious than the jokes around it, but also more interesting than the panic around it. When people say marijuana is relaxing, or harmless, or dangerous, or useful, they are often talking as though it enters the body like a neat answer to one neat question. It does not. It meets the endocannabinoid system, a signaling network the brain already uses in regulating balance, stress responses, memory, mood, and development. The Surgeon General's advisory states that cannabinoid receptors are critical for brain development and are part of the endocannabinoid system that helps shape brain circuits important for decision-making, mood, and responding to stress. That means THC is not speaking to a decorative little side pathway with nothing important at stake. It is leaning on a system involved in how the brain steadies itself and how it grows. So even when the experience feels ordinary, domestic, or funny, the biology under it is still consequential. There is a useful humility in that. No one entirely steps outside their own biology. People often speak as though there is a pure self somewhere behind the brain, untouched by sleep, hormones, stress, illness, caffeine, grief, love, alcohol, or anything else that changes mental life. In daily life, that simply is not how it works. The mind is what the brain is doing. So when a substance repeatedly changes attention, softens memory, bends time, shifts reward, quiets some worries and amplifies others, it is not changing something trivial. It is changing the process by which you become yourself moment by moment. That does not automatically make marijuana evil, and it does not make every user foolish. It just means the honest conversation has to begin in the right place. The question is never only whether the experience feels pleasant. The deeper question is what it means to repeatedly alter the machinery through which you make choices, form habits, interpret people, and know what kind of day you're having at all. This matters especially for younger people, because the brain is still developing into the mid-20s. The CDC says the teen brain continues developing until around age 25, and that cannabis used during adolescence and young adulthood may harm the developing brain. It also says teen use is linked with difficulty thinking and problem solving, problems with memory and learning, reduced coordination, trouble maintaining attention, and problems in school and social life. The Surgeon General's advisory adds that frequent marijuana use during adolescence is associated with changes in brain areas involved in attention, memory, decision-making, and motivation, with higher risks for psychotic disorders as frequency rises, potency rises, and age at first use drops. That does not mean every young person who uses marijuana is marked forever by a single bad decision. It does mean that youth use is not just an earlier version of adult use. It is a different biological situation because the brain under the drug is still building itself while it is being asked to adapt to the drug. Modern potency sharpens that concern. The Surgeon General's advisory says the marijuana available today is much stronger than older versions, notes that THC concentrations increase substantially over time, and warns that concentrated products can contain far higher THC levels. The same advisory says higher THC exposure and younger initiation increase the risks of physical dependence, addiction, and other negative consequences, and that higher doses are more likely to produce anxiety, agitation, paranoia, and psychosis. The CDC's Cannabis Use Disorder page likewise says, products with high THC concentrations can produce stronger intoxicating effects and raise the risk of overconsumption. That matters because many people still carry an outdated cultural image of marijuana as mild, sleepy, and simple. The brain, unfortunately, does not live inside cultural images. It responds to actual dose, actual product strength, actual timing, and actual repetition. A stronger signal asks more of the system that has to absorb it. Repetition is where the meaning of all this becomes harder to ignore. Some people use cannabis occasionally and never build much of a pattern around it. Some do. The CDC says some people who use cannabis will develop cannabis use disorder, and its current estimate is that about 3 in 10 users have it. The same page says the risk is greater in people who start during youth or adolescence, and in people who use more frequently, and it lists signs such as using more than intended, trying and failing to quit, craving cannabis, continuing despite problems, and needing more cannabis to get the same high. NCCIH adds that adolescents who use cannabis are 4 to 7 times more likely than adults to develop cannabis use disorder. Those numbers and signs are not there to frighten anyone for sport. They are there because the brain is a learning organ. It learns reward, relief, routine, and repetition. If cannabis becomes the regular answer to stress, boredom, sleep, social discomfort, or emotional static, the brain can begin to organize around that answer more than the person expected. Sleep shows this very clearly. NCCIH says evidence on cannabis and sleep in people without other illnesses is uncertain, even though some studies in people with conditions like chronic pain, PTSD, or multiple sclerosis have reported better sleep-related outcomes. In other words, the bedtime benefit many people feel is real as an experience, but the science does not support a simple rule that cannabis reliably improves sleep itself for healthy users, and when regular users stop, the night often changes in a very recognizable way. NIDA's withdrawal checklist includes craving, irritability, nervousness, depression, anger, restlessness, sleep problems, decreased appetite, strange dreams, and headaches. That means a person may begin by using cannabis to smooth the evening, then continue using because evenings without it start to feel rougher, louder, and less predictable. At that point, the drug is no longer only offering a pleasant state. It may also be easing the discomfort of its own absence. There is a practical and humane way to think about that. A pattern does not become important only when it looks dramatic from the outside. It becomes important when it starts narrowing the brain's options. If relaxation begins to feel unreachable without marijuana, if ordinary pleasure seems flatter without it, if sleep feels impossible without it, if boredom becomes intolerable unless it is chemically softened, or if the person keeps promising themselves a limit and quietly stepping past it, then the issue is no longer just whether marijuana is pleasant. The issue is whether the brain is losing flexibility. That is what makes repeated use worth thinking about seriously. A healthy system can cope in more than one way. A narrowing system starts needing the same route over and over again, and then calls that necessity comfort. The CDC's criteria for cannabis use disorder are useful precisely because they focus on pattern, control, and consequence rather than moral judgment. It is also worth removing shame from the picture, because shame tends to make thinking worse, not better. The CDC's overdose treatment page states plainly that addiction is a disease, not a character flaw, and that recovery may involve therapy, treatment programs, or other forms of support. That page is not cannabis specific, but the principle still matters here. If marijuana use becomes hard to control, if it starts affecting work, school, relationships, sleep, mood, or mental clarity, that belongs in the category of health, not the category of personal disgrace. Brains adapt. Brains learn patterns. Brains sometimes learn unhelpful patterns very efficiently. None of that makes a person weak or ridiculous. It makes them human. And because it is a health issue, it also means help is a sensible response, not an embarrassing one. There is another quiet point here that matters just as much. Changing your mind for a while is not the same thing as understanding your mind. People sometimes use marijuana hoping for relief, insight, or distance from the noise of daily life. Sometimes they do feel relief. Sometimes they do feel more open, more connected, or more reflective. But marijuana also impairs attention, judgment, memory and time perception in the short term, and it can bring anxiety, paranoia, or disorientation as well. The same altered state that feels soft and interesting on one night can feel suspicious and unpleasant on another. So even when the experience seems meaningful, it is worth remembering that the instrument doing the meaning making is itself under the influence. That does not cancel every feeling or every thought. It simply asks for a little caution about treating an altered state as pure truth. Sometimes the mind under THC is insightful. Sometimes it is just very impressed with itself. And perhaps that is the gentlest place to end this quiet look. The brain is not only where your thoughts happen, it is where your habits settle, where your fears take shape, where your pleasures are learned, where your memories are stored, where your sleep is organized, and where your sense of self is stitched together day after day. Marijuana can touch all of that because it touches the brain itself. For some people, that means a temporary softening of the world. For others, it means anxiety, confusion, dependence, or a pattern that slowly becomes harder to see clearly from the inside. The most careful response is neither panic nor dismissal. It is respect. Respect for the fact that the mind is not a toy, even on ordinary evenings. Respect for the fact that young brains are more vulnerable. Respect for the fact that repeated use can teach the brain a pattern it did not originally plan to learn. And respect for the quieter truth beneath all of it, which is that whatever changes the brain is also, in some small or large way, changing the place from which you meet your own life when the room goes dark and another day begins again.